file, you can reproduce it, and it's actually like sort of infinite and yeah, everlasting in a sense, potentially, although of course data has a lifespan too. Because I suppose also along the lines of the conversation around what it means to engage using new methods and alternative media within anthropology, the flip side of that is that ethnography can be very productive in terms of folding back the concepts that you inherit through engagement with people who have very different worldview and different perspectives, and actually bringing those back in and using them to break some of your own assumptions about what it means to be human, what it means to engage with a social world, a landscape, a different species, whatever. And it's actually, in a way, that process of breaking down where you thought you were in the first place that becomes critical and very productive, of opening up new space for other ways of thinking through important things. And so in relationship to that, like, what does it mean to make or to create something that can't be broken, or maybe it can?
Well, they definitely can be broken. We do lots of work with children, and they try their best to break everything in great ways. Well, I think one of the nicest things about creating these models, particularly when you get to the point of printing them out, is that fear of breaking is gone. And I think that's a really important stage. So, like I said in the talk, I always want to pick things up in a museum, but if someone said, oh, go ahead, pick that casket up, that was, intricately carved and incredibly expensive when it arrived, in the 17th century, but go ahead, pick it up, open the door, examine it. I would never be brave enough to do that. But if someone handed me the 3D printed version, I would, and I would want to touch everything. I'd want to feel the carving. I'd want to get a sense of its, weight and its construction and all of those kinds of things. So I think the ability to do that is really, it's really emphatic. It's really important, and I think that's my favourite thing about the unbreakability of the stuff that we're dealing with. And I think the fact that it can also sort of go and sit in different places, so in terms of collapsing our sense of the global and then expanding it again, sometimes something can feel very, very important because it's the only thing. One of the nice things about the Pitt Rivers is that they have lots and lots of things in one display, and so you do get that sense of, oh, this is just one spear of all of these spears. But actually, when you then place them like your texts in those text files, when you put them all together, actually, you get a really interesting sense of one thing in a very big world, and that again is a really useful part of the process.
At this point, I'm just wondering if there's any questions from the audience as well. I'm going to open this up for questions from anyone else, because we're sort of getting towards the end now. So I just wonder if anyone else, has any questions. If not, I was going to. Oh, yeah, Peter. Hello.
Hi.
Shall we? I'll just tell you what. I'll run out.
Hi. Thank you very much for some really fascinating processes, and I wanted to ask the panel where I suppose where the role of likeness comes in, because it seems in all of your kind of works and processes there's a relationality between something virtual, actual, a dichotomy there. And I was just wondering whether you had any thoughts about the role that happens in between those kind of supposed opposites.
I can talk briefly on a project that we didn't present here, unfortunately, today. It was another ZIP exhibition by an artist called Ralph Haygate, and he, in his work, made a canvas painting of a sculpture by Picasso. The sculpture was reproduced in a book. He reproduced the photograph, printed photograph, into canvas, and then he scans that canvas as a 3D object. And there are multiple layers of transference and copying and duplication going on there. And in our conversations with him, we talked a lot about the image of Odessa, which was one of the many examples in Christian mythology of miraculous duplication. And it appeared to us, when we were back and forth conversations, that we sort of live in a a time when we were very much touching upon the ability to miraculously create with no transference of material, with no human touch. You know, we're close to that. We're so close that it kind of feels normal, and that we've sort of taken some of these experiences for granted, when they're actually, you know, 2,000 years ago it would have seemed like an act of God what we can do.
Yeah, in relation to that, by way of Velassi, given that it's my talking point of the day, Velassi also miraculously duplicates horses, and it's the likeness of a horse in the sense that it's like the negative space or the expectation of a horse's head, so it kind of prefigures, like the shape and the behaviour of a horse in that sense. So I mean, it's interesting ways to find like the places where the magical seeming contemporary technology actually touches base with other forms of virtuality, which maybe have existed for a very long time, a bit like they so. Yeah.
I think so the thing I was thinking about was about value, and the fact that, you know, it's sort of, I think what's interesting is when something's value is disrupted by the processes that you're going through. So sometimes it can be that the material object becomes ever more valuable because you've got this sort of inferior replication, or you've got so many replications now that all of that just feels like noise and you just want to get back to the original thing. Or you have the opposite experience where by reproducing and getting very close to an object and illuminating something often that can't be seen otherwise. So the coffer that I was talking about that was at the Bodleian, the way that we had to capture the images, we couldn't take photographs at the bottom, it was too fragile. So what happens with photogrammetry is that bit's just missing. So as you turn it over, it's like a void. But in this case, what that meant was that you could turn the box and see directly the lid, and that view is not available on the real thing. You can't get that close to the lid image, but you get a beautiful view of it in the 3D model, and suddenly that moment of, you know, extreme value of the 3D model, I just was really excited about that.
I think, just to finish with that point, I think there's a Walter Benjamin-esque concepts of aura and reproduction, you know, the last 20, 30, 40 years have sort of been blown out the water, unfortunately, and there is, you know, that simplistic notion of aura gets cut down by reproduction. Has just, there's so many more myriad ways it can happen now that it doesn't function that simply.
Yeah, and I guess from my perspective with the photogrammetry and my interest in errors as well, I guess, is how things don't represent what they are of as well. This is something that has particular interest to me because, especially photogrammetry coming from utilising photography as a way of, which has been for years now, a form of representation which has been questioned, but ultimately is a form of documentary. It's quite a strange technology in that it utilises something that is quite it formally used to document and represent, and yet it creates a way that it almost is inferior to that way that is so glaringly obvious. It's errors in representation, glitches, and essentially that brings into other questions: is why are these things missing? What is wrong with already our ideas of representation, and you know, what is causing these? What other agencies are being involved, essentially, which, in my opinion, would be the idea of the machine, the mechanism, the automation in this case. Are there any other questions at this stage?
Yeah, Tom, can I just...
yeah, you already got a mic, Sandy.
I just wanted to sort of bring back this conversation in relationship to this image is not available, no longer available, and just this kind of idea also of representation, and that how, you know, we've kind of set up, you know, Tom and I co-curated this day, and we've kind of set up the binary of like the physical, the physical and the digital, and yet, you know, with the digital, so often we're asking of it the same burden of representation that we have asked of, say, photography, you know, that it should replicate some kind of pre-existing reality. And I think that the anxiety sometimes caused by discussions around the digital are often because we want it to do what the real world does. So I'm just wondering, I mean, from all of your perspectives, from all of your practices, is it a constant fight against this kind of anxiety of this kind of wanting to return to a real and be, you know, and not be in this space of kind of not being sure what something really is? Is this an anxiety of our age?
I don't know. Yeah. So you mean in the sense that, you know, the want for exact replication of inside the digital to sort of replicate things faithfully. Read in the paper this morning that the new PlayStation 5 that Sony sort of announced, they're selling it up as, again, like another leap forward in representation, and how the sort of digital will be able to represent physical worlds more, our known experience of the world so much more realistically, and that being, you know, the big selling point. I kind of feel like I don't think many of the artists that we work with have those concerns. I feel like a lot of artists that you see producing VR works are actually really engaging in things that are more fantastical and things that have illuminate something that we can't experience but is on the edge of the perceivable want to experience, or the imagination. Maybe it's very different in sort of the ethnographic and sort of museum sectors, but I don't think it's such a burden for artists, but maybe that's because we don't have the massive budgets that game studios do.
Absolutely, it's a constant struggle, both in terms of the project work that I do, but also the sort of broader context in which I work, and, you know, thinking about the intrusion of the digital into the real, and also the extent to which digital data can be analysed and used to represent our world in a way that perhaps encourages us to take our eye off other forms of looking and documenting. I think my sort of personal mantra of things like this project have been to largely to reassure, you know, that that we need every type of experience, that we need not to drop this kind of encounter in order to have this one, but we need to have this one and this one and this one and as many as we possibly can. So, you know, a VR project that we're working on would put you at the point where somebody is actually carving something wonderful in the ceiling. Now, that building exists, that carving exists, but you know, likes of you and I, we're not allowed to go up there and touch it and have a look at it. But if there are ways that we can layer that real experience of looking, being in the space, feeling that space, but also having an opportunity to feel something like that and be, you know, immersed in an experience where we are at the point of the carver, that I think that's what we've got to be looking for, the experience that encompasses all of those moments.
Yeah, I think less worried, concerned with representation of the real, and maybe more, to go back to Tom's work again, the gaps or the missing links between what people assume is the digital and then its material manifestation, and those linkages. And your film pointed to the essential role that copper plays in enabling our interactions with one another online. And interestingly, everything's changing very rapidly in Mongolia right now because there's massive international investment in the mineral industry and very large-scale mining there, which has many, many repercussions. Environmental destruction on the one hand, also rising waves of new nationalist sentiment that are drawing on 13th century spirits in order to deal with other ways of defending polluted river systems and so on, the offshoot of mining, and like really interesting city-based shamanic cultures that are using languages of precious metals and coppers to define alternative futures. Like, it's all very entangled and interesting. But I think, yeah, like, manifesting that ladder and the chained relationships between the digital as something which is assumed to be virtual and its material, worldly, like, manifestation and touchdowns is really important, and that's definitely a concern.
I think these are all really good points, and I think that, like someone was asking about the sort of anxiety of our age about this representation is to do with understanding as well. That, you know, we want to be able to understand our world. This is the idea generally behind we produce so much information, big data, and all these sort of things. And there's a hope, or maybe it's a fallacy or a sort of a contradiction, really, that the more data and information we produce doesn't necessarily make it more understandable, but in fact makes more layers of understanding for us to sort of trawl through, really. And it's something that James Bridle brought up in his book, The New Dark Age, about us being in a sort of place through technology where we have no understanding of how we get this information, how it's made, and even the structures the infrastructures that sort of we live through every day as well. I think that definitely is an anxiety of our times, that as things get more complex, we have less and less understanding, and we sort of feel more, maybe more alienated from that in a way as well. I think we're going to have to sort of leave it there. I wanted to say a few quick thank yous. So thank you very much to Catherine Eccles, Eric Burns and Ryan Spriggs. I want to say a big thank you to Najia and John, who've been running the day. Thank you to Spike, who's doing the sound. Very good sound, thank you. Thank you very much to Sabine, who's been documenting this, and I think Stu as well. And a very big thank you to Sunil, who helped organise this with me as well. So a round of applause for all those people. Thank you. So there are. That's it for all the sort of. Oh no, actually, there's more live curating on upstairs. Maybe you can update us.
Yeah, I mean it's been going on, and there is a display up there, and there's still a chance to participate in that. So just go and get involved, and that runs till 4.
Yeah. So there's that, and there's still the screenings upstairs from Serena and Akash and myself in the yard. And the Akram Satari exhibition is open till 5, I believe. So please do have a look around and enjoy. Thanks very much for coming.
Thanks very much, everybody.